Yeah, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you for having me to speak on this controversial, but I think important topic. And before I continue, I just want to confirm that slides and audio are okay.
They're good from my end,
Good.
Ben.
Okay, all good. So evidence-based medicine has been a passion of mine since 30 years, I would say. I consider making medical knowledge in women's health as my core business. Here are my core conflicts of interest. And one thing before I start about the topic is this is a picture I made a month ago on holiday in Western Australia, in a small village where some of the locals had took the time to put their van truck completely full with anti-vax statements, which I found interesting. You think that might be a unique example, completely different um, uh, area of the world. This study come from Egypt. These two studies, overlapping authors. One paper published 2005, the other in 2012. And then if you look into the baseline table, it's not identical, but each green button indicates that the number is exactly the same, and each red button indicates that there is a digit difference. And on top of that, if you recalculate the p-values at baseline after randomization, then what is claimed not to be significant actually is statistical significant, which also compromises and questions proper randomization. So that as a start, I will give some outline on integrity problems, then talk how big the problem is, implications for clinical guidelines and practice, techniques to detect fraud, and then see where we are with the response from journals and editors. So this is an overview of what can go wrong in medical research. It comes from the Croatian Medical Journal. And there is a spectrum of intentional wrongdoing to non-intentional wrongdoing. And there is also a spectrum from error into fraud, easily detectable, not sure if it's always true, to more difficult to detect. So on the benign or innocent side is wrong observation, wrong analysis. I think if we're honest, we try to prevent that every day, but that is part of our daily work. And me, having published quite a lot of articles, I'm quite sure that there are these type of mistakes somewhere in my work. But I talk here about the other side of the spectrum, that is falsification and fabrication, which is, apart from illegal human experiments, the worst that somebody can do. So this is a slide I got from my previous heads of department in Amsterdam. I had some conflicts with him now and then. And he told me there is the importance of the relationship and there is the importance of the outcome. So if you think that the outcome is important, you can collaborate and negotiate and you can compete. And for me, this problem of fraud is so important that I'm not going to compromise here. So I'm not prepared to go into this area. I'm more than happy to collaborate, negotiate, and discuss. But if not, I'm prepared to compete and fight about this. So how big is this problem? Because that is, after we identified that there is a problem, an important question. You could look at the number of retracted papers. I'm afraid that's not a good measure because the process of getting a paper retracted is very time consuming and painful. The number of retractions is increasing. Is increasing. Just a moment, just a moment. Sorry for that. Other activity in my apartment. So the activity of the retractions are increasing up to more than 10,000 in 2023. Another way of looking to that is looking at the entrance of what comes into journals. And this is John Carlisle from the journal Anesthesia, who, as an anesthesiologist, checks all the papers that come into the journal, the RCTs, and he thinks if he looks at the papers without seeing the data, that 14% of the data are false. And if he asks for the data, and that is obviously a bit of a selected sample, then 44% of the data he estimates as false, and 1 in 4 studies actually as zombie. And he indicates then that that problem is unfortunately larger in some countries than in other countries. And John Ioannidis then says, as in a response of that, well, if that is true, then there might be hundreds of thousands of RCTs under us. So back to my field, obstetrics and gynecology. This is an important intervention, progesterone, for the prevention of preterm birth, where if you look into the Cochrane review, the estimate is that that reduces preterm birth and its consequences, neonatal consequences, with about 50%. So the relative risks are 0.5, 0.4. In the field, we have done, led by Leslie Stewart from York, a so-called individual participant data meta-analysis, where we asked for the raw data of the original studies. From the 49 eligible studies, 32 authors shared data and 17 did not. North America, 14 out of 15 shared. Europe, 9 out of 10. Australia was the best, 1 out of 100%. But the problem comes from Egypt, Africa, and the Middle East, where the percentage of authors that share data is unfortunately much lower. And the consequence of that is that if you redo the meta-analysis with the raw data studies only, the reduction is not 50%, but somewhere around 20%. So still a benefit, but much less strong than we initially thought. This is another example: infertility, IVF procedures, and then doing endometrial injury as an add-on before that. This is again an individual participant data meta-analysis where we identified 37 studies overall. 14 people shared data, and from these 14, 2 actually were not reliable. When we got the data, we couldn't match that to the paper, and the countries that did not share data are mentioned here. So the bigger picture, it was already said in the introduction, I do a lot of IPD, is that over a large series of IPDs, with 300 papers overall, we, with a group of dedicated students and PhD students, have approached the authors, and about 100 of them shared data, 200 did not. Unfortunately, from the 100 people who shared data, 12, so about 10% of the RCTs was actually found to be problematic. And what we find then is, I think, quite worrying. So these are examples from the data sets that we got. This is a string of birth weight, and you see that later in the database, exactly in the same order, comes back, similar with weeks of pregnancy. Right here is an example where the colors indicate patients with an exactly identical profile in the dataset. That happens here also. I routinely create for every dataset that I get a unique variable based on a couple of patient characteristics, and I sort the dataset then to see if there are identical patients in the dataset. A few can happen, of course, but not to the extent that I show here. And the fabricator of the month came from this study who sent us a data set where for BMI, we could find a random generator in the Excel spreadsheet that was sent for us. And you might be laughing now, but this paper is actually part of Cochrane meta-analysis. So I try to approach this also from a macro or mega perspective. This is an overview of 1,400 RCTs in my field, reproductive medicine, in the last 10 years. And whether you like it or not, 50% of these RCTs come from China, Iran, and Egypt. And add Turkey and India, and you're at 66, so 2 out of 3, 66% of the RCTs informing clinical practice comes from these countries. And within Europe, Italy is the largest provider of RCTs. So my question to you, do we think we have a problem? Based on the above, I estimate that at least 80% or 30% of the RCTs in women's health are fabricated or at least untrustworthy. So what are the implications for clinical guidelines and practice? Well, meta-analyses are being retracted. This is a meta-analysis published in the British Journal of O&G that is now retracted because the main paper, and this is a meta-analysis on the impact of a fetal pillow on the use in cesarean section. The main paper, after 5 years, have been retracted by the authors, and this is a meta-analysis on sildenafil that also has been retracted by PLOS ONE. This is the guideline for the management of subclinical hypothyroidism in infertility, made by the ASRM, made 10 years ago, September 2010, where the recommendation is there is good evidence that thyroid suppletion in women with subclinical hypothyroidism is associated with improvement in pregnancy and miscarriage rate. And if you look at the most recent guideline, updated, this is a year ago, that it says there is moderate evidence that this suppletion does not improve pregnancy loss. And the difference is that one study from Abdel Rahman has been removed from the guideline. So that study that is considered to be untrustworthy, I think actually it's complete fake, makes the difference in this recommendation. Another example, I work in Monash, Melbourne. Helena Teed is a global leader in PCOS. She had led the process of PCOS guidelines. When we decided to filter the guidelines for trustworthiness of the RCTs with the track tool, I come back to that later, we lost 45 out of the 101 RCTs that qualified for the guidelines. So in a robust process, we've published this in eClinical Medicine, we lost a very substantial part of the RCTs. Consequence for meta-analysis is that I think we cannot do the old, where we so attended to the forest plot in Cochrane with an overall summer estimate, but we have to distinguish between trustworthy and untrustworthy data, and we do that here, and we split it even in trustworthy data with and without IPD. So we say then, as I just showed you, some studies shared IPD and are untrustworthy, but also based on where we did not get the data from, we score these papers on meeting trustworthiness criteria or not. So the old Cochrane review would say this is comparison of oral misoprostol versus vaginal dinoprostol for induction of labor. Oral misoprostol is better with a relative risk of 1.19, statistical significant. But if you go to the trustworthy studies, or even the trustworthy studies with IPD alone, then that picture changes and there is completely no difference between the groups. So what I just showed, and I'm not going to repeat it all, is that there is a big impact of untrustworthy or fake data on meta-analysis and guidelines. And my statement is that this is completely unacceptable. Try to compare it to, for example, an airline company, British Airways, that says this afternoon 30% of our maintenance reports of our planes between flights are fabricated. I mean, that would not last till tomorrow, but I'm already working 5 years against this problem. So why is it unacceptable? Patient safety is at stake, and then I think that is the main issue. But then also trust in science, public trust in science, and I come back to where I started. There is a remarkable amount of COVID skepticists who actually respond on this topic and say, see, you cannot trust the science. And then also there are many reliable researchers also in the countries that I mentioned who work hard and do the right thing. And the country's reputation is at stake. This is recently published in the British Medical Journal, the Vitality Collaborative Research Network, that looked at the impact of retracted RCTs on the evidence ecosystem. And they estimated that an RCT that was retracted had about a 10% chance of changing the conclusions of a review. We, with a group of students, have looked at 26 Cochrane reviews, 500 RCTs, and 34%. I should update my slides here, doesn't fit exactly, but about 34% of the RCTs are considered not meeting the trustworthiness criteria. And this has impact on the direction of the effect in 4% of the comparisons, and another 40% loses statistical significance because you lose studies and therefore you lose statistical power. So what do we do about it, or what can we do about it? We have developed a checklist, published this 2 years ago. This is not rocket science. But it's just a kind of, I think the most important thing is that if you do evidence synthesis, you should ask yourself the question, are the data that I see trustworthy, or is the paper true? And maybe there should be a change of mindset from just good faith that it all will be okay to saying, well, actually, I don't believe that it's true until you can convince me that that is true. So we definitely need a change to transparency. This guideline, or this track tool tries to help with that. Again, it's not rocket science. It's looking at the author group. A few authors doing a big RCT is suspicious. You can look at retractions from the authors elsewhere. You can look at the time frame. Could the study actually be completed within a particular time? I work in IVF and infertility. Some papers are submitted 6 months after the last IVF cycle, and they claim that they can report live birth. Baseline characteristics and statistics are quite powerful. Also work from John Carlisle is the baseline characteristics are not equally distributed, but either statistical significant or too far apart that questions adequate randomizations, etc. You can redo statistics. This is a screenshot of what we call the Nick Brown spreadsheet. So Nick Brown is one of the gurus in the sleuth who look for integrity issues, and the spreadsheet baby asks you to fill in means and standard deviations, and then it calculates a p-value that you can compare with the p-value reported by the authors. I think that everybody who's doing meta-analysis actually should use these type of tools. It's more powerful to look at the work of one author at once. We're not doing that enough, I think. We've written a paper on that, published this year. But this is an overview of the work from Suez Canal University, 141 articles from the Department of ONG, 23 RCTs, and this is the distribution of the p-values from the baseline characteristics of those RCTs. And what you can see is that 25% of the p-values is statistically significant or highly statistically significant. Well, that really questions randomization. I've written to both the department, the author group, and the university a long time ago, and I'm not getting an adequate response, and that's the reason why I show this slide here. So another thing we can do is write to editors and publishers. I've done that. This is a report earlier this year in the British Journal of ONG. We've written 900 times at that time. It's 1,200 times now. The important numbers here is that if an investigation is completed, usually we are right in terms of a retraction or an expression of concern. We're currently at 250 retractions and 100 expressions of concern. But the most problematic thing at these slides is that there is an enormous amount of investigations that is still pending. And if you put that in a Kaplan-Meier curve, then after 12 months, only 12% or 15% of the investigations have been completed. And after 24 months, that is only 25%. So on average, the time between the report that there is problems with a paper and the verdict of the editor or the publisher is more than 3 years. Again, imagine that this would be British Airways. It is just completely unacceptable. And that is not a particular journal or a particular publisher, but these metrics are generally true throughout the whole population of journals and publishers. Can it be different within the regulations? Yes, it can. This is Frans Raumen, colleague from the Netherlands. I called him and says, well, you have a couple of problematic papers. He investigated 19, retracted 18 after a fair process, and wrote a very thoughtful editorial about it. But there is a lot of resistance. These are two top journals in my field, the American Journal of ONG and Obstetrics and Gynaecology. These are two RCTs. One is on rectal misoprostol, the other is on oral misoprostol. Exactly the same time period. And if you read the papers, then you would not have the idea that there is another arm, so to say. But the control arms, oxytocin and oxytocin plus ergometrin, are almost identical, whereas the authors do not report that it is a 6-arm trial or something. And here the number is 6 to 4. Here the number is 4 to 6 for the same variables. Yeah, that cannot be true. The Green Journal, a top journal, says after an investigation, we have decided not to pursue any action against the author, as we do not believe that there is ample evidence of misconduct. And yes, there he is, the Cochrane meta-analysis with the 2 studies from Khalid Khan with a sample size of almost 800. Another jaw-dropping example, this is a study from Dr. Majed, who has 19 hits in retraction watch. I think he has touched 20 now. He did a study on the effect of swimming exercise on premenstrual syndrome with this picture. Doesn't have much to do with swimming. And when I looked, I found that same picture on a Vietnamese B-log long before his study was published. So I thought this should be a clear retraction. But the publisher decides then to remove the figure from the paper for legal reasons and leave the paper and the RCT and its results unmarked. Dr. Safariniad has, I think, 30 or 40 retractions. These p-values, well, yeah, you should get an eye for it, but you can already see that this is problematic. If you recalculate them, they're all wrong. Here are all kinds of strings of identical data. Here, this is another paper. All the means and standard deviations are even numbers. Doesn't happen also by chance. And Mark Palman from Wiley says, if I ask him, what do you do with this process? Well, there has been an investigation. We have done due process and we don't see a reason to take action. This is that particular journal. The editor-in-chief has actually published a paper together with colleagues from Egypt. I asked him for the data, and here they are. The whole data set is double, a doubling of 2 times the same patients. And this correspondence is from 2023. The paper is still unmarked. And it goes on and on and on. Papers from Italy, where there is impossible similarities, and the journal says, yeah, we have seen one data set and we think that matches the paper, so we don't take any action. So what is the general response? I really do not have time for this. The journal gets 80 submissions per week. This came from an editor who later himself turned out to be a fabricator. He is at 5 retracted patients now. It exists in all specialties in every country. We're working on it. Please patient. We cannot keep up with the number of complaints you send us, said one editor to me. I said, well, I'm sorry, I cannot keep up with the number of problematic papers that you publish. And it has consequences for me. You will see that I remove a couple of slides from the presentation that's going to be online, because yesterday I got letters from a lawyer of that particular author. My own work has been extensively challenged and investigators. In essence, I don't mind that. If you're critical to others, you should accept that for your own work, but it goes to a level that it almost becomes impossible to work and collaborate. I'm accused of being a racist. I'm probably the only racist who simply hates all people. Complaints at my university, complaints at my regulatory bodies. The Australian medical authorities have been informed that I'm a racist, legal threats. And one colleague said in an email, I'm really concerned about your mental health. Is there a response? I think there is. So this is the number of RCTs from Egypt in my field. It was 70 5 years ago. It's reduced to less than 10. And we are currently at 370 papers retracted or an expression of concern. Some very prolific, problematic authors have completely stopped to publish. The Economist paid attention to it in a lead article. Very interesting, again, that when that comes out, there is a lot of COVID skepticists and other science skepticists who respond and say, well, see, there is a problem with science, and we see that also in the United States, that that argument is misused by people who have a different agenda. And there is, again, the truck that I showed you in the beginning. Interestingly, in other fields of our society, this is completely not acceptable. Daihatsu had manipulation of the safety reports in their testing part of the safety in the factory. And when that came out, the factory was completely closed. And we have seen what the response was on Boeing not doing that. But in our field, it goes on and on and on. This is an example of a paper published in September 2025. Women with endometriosis compared to a control group. You can already see that the percentages don't make sense. So 36 out of 25 is not 36%. The next table also make you think that they have calculated percentages out of 100 patients. And yes, here is table number 3, and suddenly the sample size is 100. I think we basically think that these authors thought that their paper would be or the sample size would be too large, and that would be suspicious, and therefore they adjusted it. A couple of practical recommendations. I recommend you to install PubPeer on your computer. That is a kind of a software facility around PubMed, and if you install that, then you get links on your screen that actually indicate that on a paper in PubMed a comment is made. So this particular paper that I showed you just now, I've written to the journal, but they have not taken any action. But if you have PubPeer installed and you have the paper in your screen, then you immediately get my comments with that. Retraction Watch is a useful source. There is a database on Retraction Watch where you can see whether authors have retracted papers. I think that should also be a routine if you do meta-analysis. And I don't have a slide for that, but I think also that Google Scholar is a very powerful tool that allows us to detect duplications within authors. And Google Scholar is much more powerful than PubMed because it extracts all the work of one author, including meeting abstracts, etc. And then you can see inconsistencies between meeting abstracts and final publications. So the problem is, in summary, that in large areas of the world with limited research governance, large amounts of clinical research is fabricated. A second problem is that our publishing system, including failing peer review, is not able to deal with this. And the post-publication assessment is another problem. And the academic and clinical communities look for various reasons in another direction. I think solutions are that we should investigate by the author or the institute. I think that will very much increase the efficiency of what we do as well as the sensitivity. There should be much more collaboration. There should be timelines on the investigation process, and we should develop a culture of transparency. I've currently a paper, hopefully in press soon in PLOS Medicine, where the journal now wants us to publish the data set already with the paper. To journal editors, investigate yourself in your journal, so do not wait for whistleblowers, and install PubPeer. So here are my solutions, and I'm going to close with that. In my opinion, this situation is unacceptable and that we should really take action. And with that, I give back to the chair. Thank you.